Hi, welcome back. In our last lecture, we got a PHP primer and we learned at least the basic syntax of the PHP language. In this lecture today, we are going to go through a MySQL primer. So it is going to be very similar to what we did last time with PHP, but we're going to focus more, of course, on the MySQL language, and we are going to make sure that at least you get the basic syntax that you will need in order for you to be operational with calligraphy. Of course, we are not going to do a deep dive on the language itself. We do have references in the lecture material that is on GitHub for you to get more information about it, but we are mainly going to focus on the pieces that you need in order for you to understand how to work with calligraphy. The purpose of this course at the end of the day is to learn about the framework and only about the pieces that can help you be operational with the framework itself. So from the GitHub material that is online, when we get to the lecture outline, the section that we're going to be dealing with today is the Lecture 5 Database Primer. When you go into this section, there is an exhaustive explanation of the basics of MySQL, along with several resources and references online that can help you learn more about the language. Okay, the MySQL documentation is extremely well written, and it's referenced from the course that is online. So I strongly encourage you to go and check it out. There is also another resource which we mentioned a little bit in the previous lecture, which is W3 Schools. W3 Schools, like we mentioned before, they do a fantastic job at giving you the gist about programming languages, and MySQL happens to be one of these. So I strongly encourage you to go to the W3 Schools website. Throughout the lecture today and on the videos, we might go and refer to it a little because it has some great resources and some great references there. All right, so maybe before we start, it would be good to give you a little bit of an introduction on what SQL is and what databases are. Databases, at the end of the day, if you have not been exposed to them before, they are nothing more but an alternative to your regular storage. Okay, think about it as a big storage in the cloud where you get to store all the information that your users are inputting onto your application, except that it's not handled in files like you have in your own file structure. It's not about opening a file and saving things to it. Not at all. It's really about having this common place where people can add records to the storage, read records from the storage, and so on and so forth. Now, the beauty about databases is that they are structured differently than what we typically find on a file structure. So in a local storage, they are really the information is structured in a way that can be easily read and easily stored. And the easiest way to think about databases, because at the end of the day, this is what it was based on when it was created, is to think about it as a table. Okay, and every table has a set of rows and a set of columns. The columns are the attributes of the object that you wanna represent. So, for example, if you want to create an object that you call a class like our class over here, then in that case you would create a table called class, and then that class has several items that might describe it, and those items that describe that class are columns within that table. So, for example, a class can have a title, it can have the name of an instructor, it could have a description, it could have a start and an end for as a range of time, and so on and so forth. So all of these things that I just mentioned can be represented as columns within that table. So now what that means is every time your user, for example, wants to create a class, what they would do is add a record to the table. So basically add a row to that table, and every row will become a record, and every row can be added by one or multiple users. And this is a way to store information on the cloud. And that is really the power of the databases in the general sense. Their structured representation is really what makes them fast in terms of how to get the information, but most importantly, it makes it easy to do searching among certain attributes or certain descriptions uh, uh, faster than opening a file and looking through it. And that is really what made them very, very famous in the World Wide Web in the general sense. Now, there is another particular thing about or characteristic of databases that can be very very useful is this ability of creating relationships among different tables. So, for example, if a class is composed of different lectures, then in that case, the class would be a table and the lecture would be another table. Why? Because the lecture has its own set of descriptions as well, and maybe your users might want to create lectures as well that can be part of a class, and a class is composed of many lectures. So in order to define that relationship among a class and lectures, the concept of databases makes it very easy to create this type of relationship and to say that a lecture can belong to one or multiple classes, or vice versa. A class has one or multiple classes. So there are different sorts of relationships that you could create among two tables, and by building those relationships, it's as if you're creating a link from one table to another, and it could allow you to do very powerful things such as querying or searching for information across different tables very easily, reading information across different tables in an easier way, and of course pivoting the table in a way where you could get compound information coming from both tables at the same time. So this is really in just what databases are about. Now, of course, there is a language behind, or a syntactic, grammatical programming language that is used in order to interface with that storage, if I may call it this way. And these languages are usually typically around reading the information, about creating data into the information, about updating certain records that are up there, or of course deleting them. Okay, so this is what we call the CRUD functionalities. So creation, create, read, update, and delete. And what the language, any database language, is going to allow you to do is going to allow you to do some sort of a form of one of these four CRUD functionalities. One of the languages is SQL, okay, which is a short for structured query language, okay? And there are different interpretations of that language, okay? And there are many, if you want, interpreters, or many companies that created interpreters. One of them happens to be the MySQL interpretation, which happens to be open source. And the reason why we strongly recommend using it in this course, despite the fact that it's not necessarily more powerful than the other interpreters out there, but it's just because it blends very well with the PHP language, and both of them are open source, both of them are free, and they work well together. So this is mainly why we do recommend it in this course. Caligraphy as a framework uses PHP and the SQL language through an adapter that could handle different interpreters. Okay, so Caligraphy is not necessarily restricted to MySQL. It is just a recommendation from us to say that it would be probably best to use it with MySQL, just to simplify it, at least for developers who are familiar with PHP and who in most cases um, um, know MySQL as well de facto. Okay, so now that we've mentioned this, we are going to, throughout this course, and even when we get to the calligraphy framework, we are going to interface with the MySQL interpreter, which is also, you know, uh, uh, a world out there. So we are gonna interface with that interpreter through an application that is just like any other program, and it's called PHP MyAdmin. PHP MyAdmin is very typical in the world of programming, specifically if you develop with PHP and MySQL, thus the name PHP MyAdmin, because it allows you to interface with your MySQL databases without having to use the terminal or a shell application in the general sense. PHP MyAdmin usually comes pre-packaged with any server package that you use. If you happen to create your own server locally in your own environment and you did not use a pre-package like we saw in previous lectures, you can still go ahead and download PHP MyAdmin and link it to your MySQL server and your PHP server. If you, however, used one of the servers, whether it's the MAMP or the XAMPP, both of them come pre-packaged with PHP and PHP MyAdmin in them, which is great because that means you don't have to do anything. The only thing that you need to do is to go get the credentials for your for the database server. And in order to do that, if you are using MAMP or XAMPP, you need to go to localhost slash the folder where you installed these servers. If you didn't change that and you use the default, then it should typically be localhost slash MAMP for MAMP and localhost slash XAMPP for XAMPP, depending on which server you used. And when you go into that URL, what you will find a dashboard for each of these servers, and over there is a section that that tells you what your admin user for MySQL is and what your admin password for the MySQL is. So you will need both in order for you to access PHP MyAdmin. Because the first thing you're going to see when we go to PHP MyAdmin, first thing you are going to see is really a login, and you will need the admin user and the password. So make sure you have them, and then we can proceed. Now, once you've identified those, the next step is really to go directly to PHP MyAdmin. So let's go ahead and do that. In order for you to do this, it comes again pre-packaged with your servers. All you need to do is to go to localhost slash PHP MyAdmin, and ideally you should see something like the following. So localhost slash PHP. In my case, I renamed it. I called it MyAdmin. So when I do localhost MyAdmin, then I will get onto this page. I will need to enter my username and password, which are different from yours. Make sure you have yours. And now we are in the space of the PHP MyAdmin. What you see, probably the most important piece is what you see over here on the left side. On the left side are all the databases that are created on the server that you're using. Okay, I happen to have several ones. Some of them come out of the box with PHP MyAdmin, and those are primarily used for the PHP MyAdmin program itself. So you don't need to touch them at all. And some might be the ones that you created. In your case, you might have probably one or maybe I think these information schema and performance schema, these come out of the box, and so does sys and maybe PHP MyAdmin. So maybe you will have a handful of databases that come already with PHP MyAdmin, but you don't have to worry about this. We're not going to touch any of those. We are going to create our own. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that, because the way we are going to interact with MySQL in this course and throughout all the lectures, really, we are only going to use PHP MyAdmin to create or to delete a database. Okay, and that's the only reason why we will use PHP MyAdmin. We will not use it to either create tables or do any of the CRUD functionalities on the table. All these we will do in coding. Okay, And this is what the purpose of this lecture is to learn the syntax in order for you to know what you need to do with MySQL just to be able to work with calligraphy. So the only thing that you need to do in PHP MyAdmin with MySQL is to create a table. So let's go ahead and do that together. So let's say on the left hand side, on the top, you have a link that says new. We're going to click on new. And now you get to a page that has a form that helps you create a new database table. And the database always has a database table, always has a name. Okay. So what is the name of the database we're going to be creating? Let's call it calligraphy course. Okay, and that's the name of the database. I might have said table, but it's not true. It's the name of the database itself, because that's the only thing we are going to do here. So calligraphy course. Now the next item that it's going to ask you to fill is what we call the collation, or in an easier term, it's really the character set definition of the database. As you know, depending on the languages, some characters might differ, from a country to another, from a language to another. So in order, there needs to be some form of an encoding on the characters in order to allow some of these special characters to be saved in these tables. As far as we're concerned, we want to choose at least a character encoding that is the most generic possible, okay? And the one I would recommend using is a UTF-8, because it gives you a wide set of characters, and go for a UTF-8 general CI. Okay, and once you're done with this, just hit the create button, and ideally your database is created. If you look at the left hand side, now you have a new record that got added. That is the name of the database we just created, which is calligraphy course. Now if you look at the main page in here, after you click, it's that's what you see. Then your immediate next step is to start creating tables, but we are not going to go do this here. We are going to do the creation of tables in code. Okay, so I hope you managed to create your database. What we're going to do next now is, now we can close it if we want, or we can keep it. This is really up to you. What we're going to do is we are going to use an editor. Okay, because we're going to now start touching code, and we're going to start programming. Now, if you are comfortable using Nano on the terminal, or Vim, or any other editor that is within your shell application, then I will leave it up to you to use whatever you want. I would strongly recommend to have a graphical user interface for your editor. It always helps, especially when you're writing more complex code. It comes prepackaged with some colors in it that can help you debug your code a lot easier. And some of them come pre-built with some languages in there and some autocorrects and things like that can make your programming life a lot easier. One of the editors that I personally use is called Brackets. Okay, I would definitely encourage you to use Brackets. That's if you want to remain consistent. But there are lots of others out there that you could use for your own purpose. Many of them are free and open source. Bracket is also open source. So whether it's Brackets, whether it's Comodo Edit, whether it's any IDE, really, it doesn't matter. For me, I'll be using Brackets, and so I will open it right now, and I had it open already. And usually, typically, the way these editors work, there's always some form of a navigation where you navigate through the folder, through your file structure. Make sure to point that file structure to a directory or a folder that that is on the server, that is on the document root. Remember that if you haven't seen that in the previous lectures. Okay, so once you are pointing to the document root, any file that you create in there can be served through the browser. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to create an SQL code together. And we are going to create it primarily to create tables. Okay, we are not going to create do anything else at this stage of the game. So now let's create a table together, and let's imagine that we want to create an object called projects. Okay, and we want the project to have a title, we want the project to have a category, we want the project to have a short description, and we want the project mainly to have some longer description that we might call content or something like that. It might have an image URL if you want to have an image associated with your project, and it might have maybe a URL, which is a link that can take you to something else. Okay, let's go ahead and see how we can create these items. So the first thing that you might want to do is to use create table. SQL actually is a very simple syntax because it's the way you speak is the way you code. So I want to create a table and I want to give that table a name. Let's call it projects. Okay, that's all you need to do. I want to create a table called projects, and then you open the parentheses. Parentheses is gonna somehow indicate what that table is going to contain. Now, specifically for MySQL, I would strongly recommend when you're creating the table to redefine what the character definition is. Okay, and in order for you to do that, you will need to define what we call an engine. Okay, they're gonna say it's an DB, and this you only do it once, and then you just copy it several times. DB, and then the car set is gonna be equal to UTF-8. Okay, and then you put the semicolon at the end. Always keep it handy, like I always do. So when I do this, actually we're missing the default. I'll add the default, but it doesn't matter. So keep it handy, and you're always going to copy it over and over again. Okay, great. So now that we have this, now how do we define the columns of that table? Like I said earlier, every table has a set of columns or a set of descriptors. How do we define them? Now, columns are nothing more but the equivalent of variables in any other programming languages, and each variable has a data type, and MySQL has its own. So now let's go back to the lecture, and let's go to create tables in particular, which is really a section in my W3 schools to create a table with MySQL. Let me do this. Sorry for that. My brightness went down a little bit, so let's put it up. And once you're in there, there is a section in here that I would definitely want you to see, which is the data types. The data types somewhere here. So you see there's data type preference. Understand what the different data types for MySQL are. And MySQL, just like again any other programming language, has the typical ones, okay? At least for text, for numbers, for dates, and for numeric data, and for date and time. Those are primarily the main ones that we need to care about. When we talk about text, though, there are different categories of text within MySQL, different memory or space when it's stored. So depending on what your variable or what your column might contain, you might want to consider either going for something small or something larger if it's a big set of text. And you got to choose them carefully, because the more you can't just choose everything to be large, otherwise your database will run out of memory very quickly. You might want to choose these carefully. And there are different types, so you can either use the data type char or varchar. I would recommend to use rather than char. Varchar is more of a variable length kind of strength, as opposed to char, which has a dedicated size. And what's important here is in this chart, at least in W3 schools, it always tells you whether or not you need to define the size with the data type. So for char and varchar, you see in parentheses that there is size. That means you need to define the size within them. And the size, depending on what the data type is, can either be the number of characters, or it could be the size in bytes. Okay, and this table would tell you that. So for example, varchar over here, it takes a number of characters. Okay, and it could go from 0 to 6,000 something. Whereas if you look at tiny blob, no, not tiny blob, but rather text, for instance, text takes a size, but it takes it in bytes. So whatever you're entering in here needs to be in bytes. Okay? So there are different types. I use varchar a lot. Okay, when it's a small kind of smaller kind of strings. When I start hitting the bigger text and things like that, I might use medium text. I might use long text, and very rarely I also use long blob. Long blob is really an extensive amount of data. That is typically if you want to create a form where people can, write an entire document in it, something like a Microsoft Word kind of thing. Okay, so these are mainly what I usually use. Occasionally, I also use enumerate. Enumerate is actually a collection. It's a collection of fixed specific objects. So, for example, if you have a set of tags for an object, so let's say for a lecture you want to tag it, you want to say that lecture is a development lecture, or that lecture is in English, or that lecture is in French, and so on and so forth. And you want these tags to be taken from a predefined list in the database and not just have it open-ended. Then in that case you might want to use something like enumeration. Okay, enumeration would help you fix the data set that your users can use from can use in general sense. So this is the text data type. Now let's go to the numeric. Similarly to the text, the numeric also have different data types. So they could be something like integers. When it's an integer, then you would use int. Okay, whether it's int or integer, both of them can go. Now, integer, if you look at it, it goes from that number minus something to plus something, and there are actually two descriptors of the int. The int can either be signed or unsigned. Okay, so and you can specify that in code. You can say I want an int that's signed, or I want an int that's unsigned. If it's signed, then it would go from minus this number to this number, 215 million, or maybe 3 yeah, so yeah, something like 2 trillion. I don't know, I'm not sure how to read the number, whatever it is. Okay, so it goes from minus that number to that number. Or if it's unsigned, that means it cannot be negative. Then in that case, it would go from 0 to the double of this. Okay, to the double of this number, and that would be twice as much positive numbers. Okay, so that's for your ints. Now, if you don't want to use all that space and you know that your integers are smaller in numbers, then you can go for a small int or for a tiny int. Okay, it could be that much. And remember, integers don't have any commas in them. They don't have any decimals. Okay, those are like numbers, digits. Um, um, so that's what integer is. Now there is something else called a bit. A bit is really one digit. Okay, and it's 1 bit actually, and and you can specify how many of those digits you want, and it could go from 1 to 64. So the maximum of this can be 64 placeholders for a digit. Okay, it has 64 digits. When you want to define something as a number of digits, you would definitely use a bit. Okay. All right. Now, how do we represent the decimals? You can either use the float or the double. Both of them are valid. Okay. They have different sizes and different requirements. Personally, typically, I always use the float. But you could always switch to double. You can even use decimal. Okay. All of these are about the same. Okay. I don't want you to get to get all confused with them. Sometimes they are just different because the way you define the size in them can be more helpful to you. So decimal, for example, you specify it based on the number of digits. Okay, so you would say I want a decimal and I want it to have a size 65. Okay, so the maximum number for the size is 65 actually, which is the whole max. And you can specify the size of how many digits is in your decimals. Okay, and that is literally the number of digits, so the placeholders before the decimal, and the number of digits after the decimals. The third category are the date and time. Okay, date and time, just like the name indicates, are there to represent the date and the time. So you have a data type for a date only, you have a data type for both the date and the time, and you have something, or it could be only the year, it could be only the time, or it could be what we call a timestamp. A timestamp is a number that is compounded, that is created, and from that number, and it's compounded and created actually mathematically. It's literally the number of seconds for whatever date it is. So it could be a date in 2050, for example, January 1st, 2050, and all this is automatically mathematically changed for you in number of seconds based on today, and then it's based on a day, well, actually on a reference date in the past, and that number of seconds would represent what we call a timestamp. Okay, timestamp can be very useful because it would avoid you saving particular formats in the database. It's always a set of digits, and it doesn't have slashes or dashes or things like that, which makes reading the information and also storing the information a lot easier. The only difference is when you have a timestamp value, you would need to do something when you're reading that value and before displaying it to the user. Otherwise, it's not going to make any sense to the user. You would need to apply a format to it, or to apply a decoding mechanism in order for you to get the dates and the times out of it. Okay, so this is in just our what data types are about. So now let's go back to the code, because what we really want to do now is define our columns. So let's say we do have a column. There are different columns, okay, and we'll go through them one by one. Now remember this: every column, every table needs to have an ID. Okay, the ID is the index of the table. It is that number that is automatically incremented for you every time a record is created. So every time there's a row, there's a number that increments, and that allows you to access a particular row directly. There is no way not to have an ID for a table. Okay, it is not recommended. That means there is no way for you to easily address a row in a table. So whatever you do, you always need an ID for a table. Now, in calligraphy, there is a convention that every table, its primary index, we call it a primary key. Every time I say ID, I mean the primary key of that table absolutely needs to be called ID. Okay, an ID like this. So I have something called ID. Now IDs are usually numbers, so I want it to be an int. It's an integer. I'll give it 15, but you can give it whatever you want. And you always need to specify whether this value can be null or not. Since it's the index, we never want it to be null, which means it's a required value. Now, since we want it to always be there, and we want it to always auto increment, because we don't necessarily want to specify the ID every time somebody is entering information in there, it will become quite a hassle. You definitely want the database to take care of that for you. What you would do, you would say, I want it auto increment. Okay, so what this is telling me is create a column called ID of integer 15. It cannot be null, and I want you to auto increment it constantly. And you always put a comma to separate these different columns that you create. So ID is one. Great. Now let's give it a title. Every course needs to have a title. Now the title can be a varchar. Okay, it's a varchar. I mean, let's say it won't exceed 150 characters. Can it be null? Sure, but let's make it not null as well. Or actually, let's make it could be null. And how do we define when it could be null? We need to give it a default, all right? And the default for it is null, meaning it could be empty. Null is always a reference to, instead of saying empty, you would say null. So title varchar 150, and the default is null. Great. Let's say now, actually, do I want to say project has a title? Yes, project has a title. I like that. Now, also, project has a short description. Short description now might be maybe a little longer, but we do maybe want to restrict it. So let's say we say it's also a varchar, but we're going to restrict it to 250 characters. And yes, it could also be null. Okay. Now let's say it has a bigger content. Okay, and that bigger content, let's say it's going to be a long text, and the default is also a null. Okay. Now let's also say that it could take a URL for an image. So we say image URL. I personally use what we call the camel K. The underscore syntax. The underscore syntax is you separate the words by an underscore. Okay. Some other people prefer the camel case. The camel case means it would look like this. So you start with if it's a two different word compounded name, then in that case the first word would be in small caps, and then any other names compounded to it would always start with the large cap, so it would look like this. Okay, this is called the camel case. I will go with the underscore one, like that. Okay, it's a choice. Calligraphy doesn't have necessarily a restriction around it, except for one situation, and we will mention it when we talk about calligraphy. So I would strongly recommend that you go with the camel case, at least in MySQL. When you're dealing with your own code in PHP, the preference is to go for a camel case version. All right, so image URL. This is, again, it could be a varchar, and we could limit it to 200 characters, and it could also be null. Now we define at least basic, columns in there. Now what we need to do, we need a way to tell the database that the key in here is ID. It's not sufficient to say that it's just auto increment. Okay, we need to explicitly define what makes it a primary key. So we're going to do primary, and then primary key, like that. And what is the primary key? It's ID. ID is our primary key. And ideally, this should do it. Okay, now I might have some errors. In order for us to avoid any sort of errors, let's compare it to one that I previously created. Primary key ID. This seems correct. Auto. It seems to be all right. Now there's one more thing that every database needs to have. Okay, and I will we will do it together, and then we will compare it to the one that I created. Every database needs to have a timestamp. Okay, that timestamp needs to indicate when it was created and when it was last modified. This will help you significantly in many cases. In every table that you create, get into the habit of adding these two elements: created at and modified at. Okay, and those are timestamps. Okay, and they have a default, and their default is now. Okay, so by default we're gonna say it's the now. Modify that, it's also a timestamp, and its default initially is also a now. But we want to do something else. Every time this table is updated, we want to update it again. We want to update only the modified date and not the created date. We keep the created date constant all the time. So how do we do that? There is something called onUpdate in MySQL, and then we say grab the now again on update. And that should do it. Comparing, exactly what we have here. We can say not null, or we can say default. That doesn't matter. So every time you say default, null or not null, sorry, in this case we forgot to add the null as well. When we want to make it required, it would be good to specify the not null all the time. Okay, it's more of a recommendation, but you guys can get try it out, figure out what works, what doesn't work, and then slowly you'll realize that you become very familiar with the language. It's actually very basic. What we did here is we created the table, gave it a name. In parentheses in there, we define the columns of that table. Okay, what is our first column? What is our second column? What is our third column? And so on and so forth. For each one of those columns, we absolutely start by defining the data type for it. Some data types might require size, some others might not, like long text. Okay, In order for you to know that, you would go to the references, either the MySQL documentation or W3 Schools, and you can get that information. Then you need to define descriptors for that column. Descriptors means, is it a required one? If it's a required one, then it absolutely needs to have a default, okay? Well, not necessarily it needs to have a default, but it needs to be defined as not null, okay? If you want to give it a default, then you would follow that with the attribute default, and then you will give it the value that you need, okay? If you want something to be automatically done on an attribute, such as an auto increment, then you would add the function auto increment to it at the end. If you want other functions, such as on update make a change, then in that case you would use the onUpdate function, and then you would say what its new value would be. That's really about it. Now, how do we execute this code? And how do we really create that table in the database that we just created on PHP-MyAdmin? That's when we're going to go back to PHP-MyAdmin. Okay, and from here, from this section, we are on Calligraphy course database. What we're going to do is we're going to import. Okay, what we're going to import is this SQL file that we just created. Okay, something maybe that I have not mentioned before is make sure to create the file .sql, all right, because it's an SQL script. So now let's go and take a look at, sorry, I might have to travel around all the way to my server. Which happens to be Calligraphy course. Here we go. Sorry for the delay. And create projects. So this is really the SQL that I wanna. SQL, by the way, is another term for SQL. Instead of saying SQL, you would say SQL. It's up to you how you want to pronounce it. Once you do this, you hit go, and ideally, everything went well. Okay, now if you look at the left hand side, you see your Calligraphy course, and there's a new record that got added underneath called project. When you click on that one, now you see the columns. Okay, you see ID, you see title, you see short description, you see content, you see image URL, etc., etc. Now if you want to know more about these columns, if you look at the top over here, there's a tab called structure. When we click on structure, over here now you'll see really the qualifiers of each and every column. So now for ID, you know it's a type int, you know that it's not null, it doesn't have a default, but it's auto incrementing. Okay, so it gives you everything that you wrote in code basically. Something else that is quite of an interest, ID, you see a key next to it. This is to indicate that it's a key, and at the very, very bottom of it, somewhere in here, here you go, it tells you indexes. Your primary key is unique, and it's for column ID. Okay, this is what tells the database that the ID is the primary key for your table. Awesome. So with this, we've created our first table in MySQL. Now you can, go ahead and try things out in here. You can add rows by using the insert, okay? When you do the insert, you get a form to go ahead and enter stuff in your database. But I don't necessarily want you to do any of this right now, because when we start talking about calligraphy, you're going to see this is going to magically happen. All the insertion, the deletion, and things like that. So I don't want us to worry about it just yet. But if you want to explore PHP-MyAdmin, go ahead and do it as well. Now, it would be interesting because you might try things a lot, and in some cases MySQL might create the table for you, even though there are some errors or there are some things that you want to adjust. So while you are in development, I would strongly recommend that you always do drop table if exists projects. What this is going to do is, if a table exists, if this table already exists, but you're trying to override it every time you import, then delete it. Delete it, and then it will add it again. Okay? Just make sure to use this function properly. I don't want you to use it on a database that already has records in it. That's very dangerous. But while you're in development, and for as long as you're still creating your database, it's okay to have that there. Now, from the moment you're done, comment it out. In order for you to comment out in MySQL, you would use the slash star in the beginning and then star slash at the end, and that would comment out this. But while you're in development, you are more than free to do this. Okay, there is a shortcut if you're using brackets. That doesn't work for MySQL, I don't think. Okay, let's forget about this. I thought there was a way to easily comment with MySQL, but there isn't. All right, so with that being said, let's go ahead now, since we already have a table, and I'm going to show you what it does when I import it again. It's going to allow you to do it. Okay, but if I don't do this, so I'm going to comment it out like that, because I want to show you the error that it produces. And I go back to calligraphy course, I go to import, and I go choose, and I choose my SQL again, and I go. Now it's going to tell you we cannot do it because there's already a table that exists. However, if I do the drop like that, and I run it again, import, deleting a table means drop a table in the MySQL language. I do go, now it works again. Okay, so it recreated the database and it created it empty for you. Great. Now, I would want a hint to how to do an insertion. An insertion means I'm adding a record, and we're going to do it just for one purpose, because in some cases, when you first start, you might want to insert some items just to test out the code. You can do it in coding, you can do it in MySQL directly in here. This would be up to you. If you want to do it in code, I do want to give you a way to do it. And really the way it works is very easy. Just to accelerate the process over here, I'm going to copy this statement. It's really insert into the name of the table. In our case, it's projects. And what values you want to insert. And these values, not the values, but the name of the columns that you want to insert to. You absolutely need to have in parentheses all the, let me just delete this, okay, because this is really the syntax. It's insert into, name of the table. In parentheses, you will define what columns you want to insert to, and you absolutely need to have all the required ones. What do I mean by required? It means all the not null one. Otherwise, MySQL might create an error. Of course, you do not need to add ID because ID is an auto increment. Okay, so it's happening for you automatically. All right. Title, you don't need to add it because it has a default. Short, no need to add it because it has a default. Content, no need to add because it has a default. Created and modified, no need to add because it has a default. So all of them, you don't actually need to add, and you can keep it empty if you want, but then there's no point of inserting anything if you want to keep it empty. So in that case, let's do add on title, and let's do add on short description. Okay, and what values do we want to add in there? For title, let's say this, let's say first project, and then you separate by commas, always in brackets, always in quotes whenever you're giving the values, either double quotes or quotes, both should work, and you say this is the first project. And ideally, all the rest of the data should be filled for you in the rest of the column. We're only adding title and short description. So let's go ahead and run our SQL again. And right now, not only will it create the table, but it should also insert a row for you. Let's see. Oops, seems to work. So let's go to projects. Not only we have a table, but now we have a row that got added that has the ID 1. In fact, because it's the first one that we created. First project, this is the first project, and the rest is null. And notice how created at already created the date for you, modified that already created a date for you as well. Okay, this is the magic of databases. We can do the same thing using the insert of PHP MyAdmin. You don't need to specify an ID. Let's say this is second project. Okay, short description, we're going to say this is with PHP MyAdmin. And then we're not going to add anything else. We're going to hit the go. Okay, I go back now, to projects. Here we go, second project. This is with PHP So we just inserted a record in two different ways, one in code, one in PHP Keep those syntaxes in mind. Now, just to tell you, this code and moving forward, any code that we create, you are gonna get it from GitHub. I will show you at the end of the lecture how I will do this and where you can get it from. Okay, it will be called a database primer for this course. Depending on the name of the lecture, there will be a folder in it that will give you access to these examples. Okay, I'm not gonna do anything in code that will not be accessible from this point on from the GitHub. Everything that we've done before was not really coding yet, but from this point on, just to have certain syntactic examples or syntax examples, then you will see them directly on GitHub. Great. So now, what do we do next? There is another notion that I would like you to be aware of. Okay, there is something else called a foreign key. Earlier, I was talking about creating a relationship between a table and another. There are different types of relationship, and we're going to dig deeper into them when we talk about calligraphy. One type of relationship is the many-to-many relationship, or one-to-many, or many-to-one, or one-to-one. A one-to-one relationship means one record in one table can be linked to exactly one record in another table, and vice versa. What this means, it means, for example, if I have a class table and a lecture table, if there is a one-to-one relationship among them, that means every class has only one lecture and every lecture has only one class. That's a one-to-one. A one-to-many means that the one is on the side of class, so every class has many lectures, okay? But every lecture can belong to many classes. All right? That's a one-to-many relationship. And so on and so forth. In order for you to define these relationships, there is a need to link them together. There is a link that needs to happen. That link can either be one-sided or it could be double-sided. What we are gonna, or what I would like to show you, is how at least to do a link. And that link is called a foreign key. A foreign key means I have a key in this table that points to the index, so to a row that is in another table, and we call this a foreign key. In order for us to create a foreign key, we do need to create another table. So let's go ahead and create another table very quickly. And let's call it users. Okay, we need users at some point. Every application needs users. And just like we said, it has an ID. I'm going to copy this as is. And let's say for the time being, the user just has a name. Okay, we'll fix all this. Sorry, it's a varchar. And let's put it at 40 or 50. And then it's not null. And the default is no. I don't need to specify not null. Okay. And now I want this particular user, actually let's say it's not null. Okay, we want to oblige to have a value. And it doesn't really mean anything, I just want the example to work. Now let's say that every user can have multiple projects. Okay? Or vice versa, but let's do it this way. We want every one user to have multiple projects. Then in that case, that's the reverse means that every project can belong to one user. So we want an ID in here that points to a record for one user. Why? Because every project has one and only one user. So the many relationship, you do not need to define anything for it, because by default, all of them are somehow linked in a many-to-many kind of relationship. You can query them in that way. From the moment you create that link, you need to focus on where the one goes. Okay? And wherever the one is where your foreign key should be. In our case, one project can have access, can only have one user. So my foreign key to the user needs to be created on the project side. So how do I do this? The way to do it is I would say foreign key. And what is the name of the foreign key? I don't have it yet, so I need to go and create it. So here's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to create a key that is just like ID, but that points to users. So let's start by creating the key first. And there is a convention, at least in calligraphy, is that the name of the key is always the name of the table underscore ID when it's a foreign key. It's the table name underscore ID. And then it's going to be an int 15. This cannot be null. And we don't want to auto increment or anything because we do want to give it a value at whenever we actually insert a record. We need to define to which user it belongs. So it's not null. If you don't want to define that, you would say it's okay. It could be null in the beginning, but then I would do the association later. Okay, which can be a possibility too. It makes it easier for programming. So that means when I first create my project, it could be null, but then later on I need to define a user for that. Great. That's of course if I want to benefit out of the querying the relationship and reading the value out of it. Great. So now I created the ID, but I need to define it as a foreign key. So now I go back, I say foreign key. What is the name of the ID? It's user's ID, just like that. And what does it do? This user ID, it references, what does it reference? It references my table users. At which column it references it? At column ID. And I'm done. This creates a foreign key. Now, there is something else to consider, which is what happens if I delete a user? Or what happens if I delete a project? So, when I delete a user or a project, then I want something to happen with my table. Okay? I would want if I delete the user, then all the projects associated with that user to be deleted. Right? Because it no longer makes sense anymore. If I want that to happen, then I would need to say on update, on delete, cascade. Great. But also, every time I make a change to either user or project, I would want that to update as well. So what I'm going to say on update, cascade. Okay? That cascade is really the function that will help bubble up all the changes and depending on the changes. If it's a delete, then I definitely want to delete everything as well. And by everything is if I delete the user, anything associated with that user will be deleted. And if I want to update, when I update the user, I also want this table, at least ID, to update. So if for whatever reason I update the ID here, it should be updated in this table as well. Great. But now MySQL in particular does not allow you to make changes on keys unless you alter the table. There is a way around it, and that is creating what we call a constraint. So you're going to say constraint. You're going to give a name to that constraint, and in our case it's a constraint called F, foreign key, and it could be anything, by the way, foreign key, projects, and users, like that. That's all you need to add just for MySQL to work properly. Great. So now let's go try it out. But what I need to do here is I definitely need to create a user. So let's insert into users, name, and then values. Let's say the name of the user, and let's say it's Dory. Just like that. Okay? And like I mentioned earlier, don't forget also to add the engine thing for the user table. Great. Now that we have that, it should insert Dory, And now I'm inserting the project, but I'm not yet linking it to users. So what I need to do is I need to link it to the ID of the user. Okay, but I don't know the ID yet, so there needs to be some programmatic to identify the ID once it's done. But at least right now we know that it's going to be ID1 in that user table. So just for the simplicity, let's put 1 over here. And over here we need to specify that what I am doing is I'm adding a user's ID. Sorry, I put it in quotes. It shouldn't be in quotes. Here we go. So now it's going to link this project that we create to ID of Dory, which will happen to be a 1. Okay, and you got to make sure in this case that you create Dory before you insert the project. All right. Now there are a couple of things that we need to worry about when we look at this code. Let's go back a little bit to create table users. I mean, we have not defined, or we have not told the database, or specifically this particular table, that its primary key its ID, which might be a problem down the road. So we might need to say primary key ID, just like we said up there. The primary key for this table is ID. Great. So we have that. Now we got to do the same thing. We got to make sure to drop the table if it exists. Why? Especially if we want to do this multiple times. So we're going to add drop table if exists users. Okay. And there's something else that you need to pay attention to. Whenever you have a foreign key within a table, you got to make sure that the table that it points to is created before. Otherwise, MySQL will complain about it. So in that case, we got to make sure to create the users table before we create the project table. Okay. And this is very important because, you know, MySQL will complain about it, and sometimes you might spend time trying to debug the code when in fact it's just a matter of ordering. So let's go and try now this code in PHP MySQL. So I'll go to import. I choose my file. I choose create projects. I do open. I hit go. Oh, we have a problem. I think drop table if exists user cannot delete the foreign key. Yes, indeed. Okay, so it's not gonna allow you to drop it because it has to be after. Okay, so you need to drop projects before you drop users. Why? Because it has a foreign key. So it goes in the reverse order of creation. When you're creating, you create the users before you create the projects. However, when you're dropping, you gotta make sure to delete the projects before you delete the users. And ideally, this should be okay. So let's go, hit go, and here we go. Now we just created projects, and we created a user within that project. So we have one project over here. Notice the last attribute. It has 1 because our user, the one that we create, Dory, will take ID 1. And if you notice, when you hover on it, it has a link. So when I hover over it, it tells me the name of that. Well, it did for a while, but then it did not. Let's see if it does it again. Here we go. It says it's Dory. You can also click on it, and it will link you to the users table with Dory in it. So let's do that. Now notice here it linked me to users, and I can see my the record that it points to. Now I want you to go back to project, and let's take a look at the structure again. Okay, notice that so our primary key always has this yellow key next to it, whereas our user's ID key, which is a foreign key, has this gray element. Those keys would allow you to identify what is local, what is a local key, primary key, and what is a foreign key that's point to another table in the database. So here we go. Let's go back a little bit to this code, which now I'm gonna post it on GitHub for you to have access to it the way it is. The only thing I am going to add is how to do a comment. So if you want to do a comment in MySQL, okay, and it should be like that, and I will save that. And then you will have access to create projects.sql. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to use GitHub. This, is good because it will be another reminder for you. So when I go to my document root, I put all this in a folder called Calligraphy course, okay? And it's the repository on GitHub is already there. So I'm going to do git status. It tells me that you have a folder called database primer that I created, and that is true. So in my database primer folder, you will find the create projects SQL. And so I am going to add this whole folder. I'm going to do git add dot to say add everything. And I'm going to say commit. Okay, if you don't remember all these commands, these were part of previous lectures. I would strongly recommend to go back to them because we're going to do this often. So git commit, I'm going to add a message and I'm going to say this is the database primer lecture code. Okay, it added it successfully and I'm going to do push all. And ideally I'm done. So now let's go back to our GitHub, which I believe we lost, but if we do it back here, another back, I get to my GitHub. If I go back to the home of GitHub, okay, we still see, the documentation, but at the same time, you see database primer over here and tells you this is the database primer lecture code. When you click on it, now you see the different files in there. I have other examples also for you. So create DB, which is somehow very similar to what we created in a more complete format if you want to use it. And I'm also showing if you want to separate files and create different SQL files. Each SQL has a different command. I'm giving you another example on how to do it as well. Okay, so you can use these at well. With that, I hope you enjoyed the course today. You will I would from now until we start using calligraphy, go ahead and play around with the MySQL after you read about it. Practice some of these syntactic statements that we created together. And there's nothing to worry about at this stage. You can delete, you can drop, you can add records, you can make mistakes. So I would strongly encourage you to do that. And then when we start talking about calligraphy, all this will become clearer for you. I hope you have a great day. And in our next set of lectures, we are going to learn about calligraphy. In the immediate next one, we are going to learn how to download calligraphy. We are going to see a little bit how it's structured, and we're going to start playing around with this absolutely fantastic framework. With that, have a great day, and thank you for watching.